I signed the divorce papers with a smile, because my husband thought he was inheriting $5 million from my mother. He called me an ATM and kicked me out of my own house. What he didn't know, that money, it wasn't his. And I was the only one who knew the truth, until it was too late. The first time I met Ethan, I was standing in the break room at the hospital with a paper cup of bitter coffee and a heart that hadn't stopped aching in over a year. He was there to pitch a medical finance software to our administration, and I was too tired to care about corporate jargon. But he had a nice smile, easygoing, gentle eyes, the kind that made you feel like maybe the world wasn't entirely out to break you. I'd been a nurse for nearly 2 decades. My first husband, Mike, passed away from pancreatic cancer 2 years prior. It was fast 6 months from diagnosis to goodbye, and I had watched him fade with a helplessness that still haunted me. We'd had a good marriage, not perfect, but solid. After he passed, I kept working. That's what people like me do. We push forward because we have to. But the silence in my house, the stillness in my bed, the way I made 2 cups of coffee in the morning before remembering those things stayed with me. I had friends, coworkers, and my son, Jake, who called weekly from Denver. But it wasn't the same. I didn't realize how hollow I had become until Ethan started showing up in little ways that filled the quiet. At first, we'd just chat when he came by the hospital. Nothing flirtatious, just human. Then he invited me to lunch. We talked about music, travel, the dumbest things we'd done in our 20s. I told him about Mike, and instead of changing the subject, he nodded quietly and said, "Sounds like he was lucky. He didn't ask about money, didn't push for details." That made me trust him more. We started seeing each other outside of work, just coffee at first, then dinners, movie nights. He was lighthearted, funny in a self-deprecating way, and didn't try to fix me, just listened. Sometimes I needed that more than anything. After months of gentle steps, we finally started dating. My friends were skeptical. "It's only been 2 years," they said. "Are you sure he's not after your savings?" I understood their concern. Between Mike's insurance, my own savings, and some smart investments over the years, I was in a comfortable place financially. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't worried about retirement either. Still, Ethan never made me feel like I was a paycheck to him. When he told me he was divorced, I didn't pry. He said it didn't work out, and I left it at that. Maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe I was just tired of living in the past. He made me laugh again. That counted for something. I met his dad about 6 months into our relationship. His name was Walter, and he lived alone in a beautiful 2-story farmhouse just outside Portland. It needed some work, but it was charming. Ethan had moved back in to help take care of him after Walter's health began declining. "He's getting older," Ethan had said, "and I owe him." Walter was kind but quiet, sharp too. He asked questions that made you think about work, life, values. He didn't talk much about his career, but Ethan mentioned he'd owned several businesses and sold them over the years. Apparently, he'd done well, very well. I noticed the way Ethan would sigh and roll his eyes when Walter made comments. He could have retired in a beachfront house in California, but no, he stays here like a hermit, he said one night. "I think it's noble," I replied. Ethan just snorted. We dated for a year before he proposed. It wasn't a flashy moment. No ring hidden in a dessert or grand gesture. Just the 2 of us on a chilly November walk, holding hands, when he stopped and said, "You make life feel worth something again. Would you marry me?" I said yes. We had a small ceremony, just family and a few close friends. My son, Jake, flew in and walked me down the aisle. He didn't say much, but I could tell he had doubts about Ethan. "Just be careful, Mom," he said quietly at the reception. "That guy's a little too slick for my taste." But I didn't want to hear it. I needed this. I needed someone to share my days with again. After the wedding, I moved into Walter's home with Ethan. It was his dad's house, but they had space for me and plenty of privacy. I was still working full-time, and Ethan said he was taking a break from contract work to focus on Walter and the house. At first, everything was fine. Ethan cooked, cleaned, helped his dad with physical therapy. Walter even complimented him once, saying, "He's finally growing up." I laughed. I thought we'd made it, but slowly, things began to shift. Ethan started sleeping in more. Dishes would sit longer in the sink. "It's been a rough week," he'd say, even though I was the one working 12-hour shifts. He forgot to pick up Walter's prescriptions a few times, then blamed the pharmacy for not calling. One night, I came home and found Walter trying to get himself up from the recliner. He looked exhausted. "Where's Ethan?" I asked. "Out running errands," Walter said, then hesitated. Again. That was the first time I saw something different in Walter's eyes. Not disappointment, just weariness. He loved his son, but there was something in his expression that made my heart sink. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself Ethan was just stressed. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Taking care of a parent isn't easy, and he wasn't a nurse like me. I offered to take over more of the caregiving in the evenings, but Ethan resisted. No, you're tired. I've got this," he'd insist. Still, Walter looked more and more drained, and the more I stepped in, the more Ethan pulled away. The man who once made me feel safe now seemed like a roommate with a short temper and a growing list of excuses. I tried to talk to him, tried to ask what was going on. He'd laugh it off, say, "I'm just in a funk. I'll bounce back." But something in my gut whispered, he never planned to bounce. Ethan's funk didn't bounce back. If anything, it started to settle in like an old house guest who had no intention of leaving. Dishes stayed dirty longer. Groceries went unbought. The laundry piled up even though he was home all day. And worst of all, Walter began to suffer for it. One afternoon, I came home early from a shift at the hospital. I'd swapped hours with a coworker and figured I'd surprise the guys with dinner. Instead, I found Walter alone in the kitchen trying to heat up a can of soup. He was wearing socks on a slick tile floor, shaking from the effort of holding the can opener. "Where's Ethan?" I asked, setting my bag down and rushing over. Walter sighed, eyes focused on the counter. Said he had an appointment. I helped him sit, made him a sandwich, and we talked quietly over dinner. He didn't complain, not directly, but he didn't need to. "He's got a good heart," Walter said at one point. Just never learned how to use it properly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, going over the last 6 months in my mind. It wasn't just about the chores or the house. It was the silence, the distance, the strange way Ethan seemed more distracted lately, asking vague questions about my mom's will, or making weird comments like, "Wouldn't it be easier if we sold this place?" The next morning, over burnt toast and a half-hearted apology from Ethan about losing track of time, I decided to stop pretending. I asked if he was okay, really okay. He looked at me, shrugged, and said, "Just tired, Sin. Taking care of Dad is no joke." "Then let me help more," I offered. He leaned back, crossed his arms. "I thought that's what I was here for." That stung. He said it like a challenge, like I was stepping on his role as caregiver, even though he was clearly failing at it. "I'm not trying to take anything away from you," I said gently, "but I'm worried about both of you." He got up, dumped his half-eaten breakfast in the trash, and muttered, "I'm doing the best I can." But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. A week later, Walter took a bad fall in the living room. I wasn't home, Ethan was. When I got the call from the hospital, my heart dropped. Walter was okay, thank God. A bruised hip, some stitches, but no permanent damage. Still, the look on his face when I walked into the ER broke me. Not because he was hurt, but because he was ashamed. "I didn't want to be a burden," he whispered, voice shaking. He left me to take a call, and I thought I could get up on my own. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard it bled. Back at home, I asked Ethan what had happened. He didn't lie, he never really lied, but he downplayed it. "I was just outside for a second." He must have gotten up too fast. "You said you were taking a call." He waved me off. Same thing. It wasn't. Not anymore. That night, I sat in the bathroom with the door locked and cried into a towel like a teenager. I didn't know what I was mourning more, Walter's dignity or the version of Ethan I thought I married. Jake called that weekend. He was planning a short trip to Oregon to visit. I didn't tell him everything, but I hinted that things weren't going well. He didn't say "I told you so," but I could hear it in his silence. "Just be careful, Mom," he said. I know you don't want to believe it, but that man has a way of looking out for number one. After Walter was discharged, I insisted on hiring a part-time home nurse. Ethan resisted again. We don't need strangers in here. I can't be here 24/7, and neither can you, I replied. It's not up for debate. He stormed out and didn't come home until 2 a.m. For a few days, things settled. The nurse was a sweet woman named Karen, about my age, and Walter immediately warmed to her. I saw life return to his eyes. He joked with her, asked about her grandkids. It was like seeing a flicker of the man he used to be. Ethan, on the other hand, became colder, sharper. He stayed in the garage more, started taking long drives to clear his head, and barely spoke to me unless he needed something. One night, I came home to find a fancy golf club set in the living room, brand new, expensive, still with the tags on. Where did this come from? He shrugged. Treated myself. We've got room on the card. You're not even working. I'm doing side stuff online. Relax, Sin. I've got a handle on it. He didn't. The bills started piling up. I noticed larger withdrawals from our shared account. When I asked, he said, I needed some breathing room. What's the big deal? The big deal was that I had trusted him, not just with money, but with my life, my home, and my family. Walter saw the change too. One evening, as I helped him get settled for bed, he looked up at me and said, I know he's not the man you thought he was. I tried to warn you. I didn't want to hurt you. My throat tightened. You didn't. I just didn't want to see it. I've made arrangements, he added softly. About the house. About everything. You'll be fine. I didn't understand what he meant until much later. For now, all I could do was hold his hand and whisper, thank you, because I was starting to see the truth. My husband didn't just lose his way, he never had one. And when Walter was gone, I had a feeling Ethan's mask would drop for good. I noticed the change the morning after Walter made that cryptic comment, I've made arrangements. Something about the way he said it stayed with me, humming in the back of my mind like a tune. I couldn't place. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd hear. The air in the house had grown heavy, not angry exactly, but uneasy. Ethan was rarely around, and when he was, he'd keep his voice low and curt, like we were all inconveniences in his way. The warmth that once made me feel safe in our marriage had evaporated into something thin and cold. Walter kept quiet most days, but I noticed his gaze followed Ethan more closely, like he was watching something he'd already predicted come to pass. 2 weeks later, Walter's health took a turn. He became weaker, more fatigued, and struggled to eat. Karen, our part-time nurse, gently suggested we speak to a palliative care specialist. I nodded, heart sinking. That evening, Ethan barely looked up from his phone when I broke the news. Dad's not bouncing back this time, I said softly. We may be looking at weeks, not months. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer a hug or a word of sympathy, just stared at the screen and said, So, what's the plan with the house when he's gone? My breath caught. I stared at him, waiting for a follow-up, something kinder, but he just kept scrolling. That's what you're worried about right now? I asked, unable to hide the sting in my voice. He glanced up, shrugging. You said it yourself. It's not looking good. I just want to be prepared. Prepared. That word rattled in my chest. I'd always known Ethan had a carefree streak, a lightness I used to find charming. But now it felt like hollowness, like there was no depth under the surface, no weight to the things that mattered. A week later, Walter called me into his room. He was sitting up, pale but alert, with a manila folder resting on his lap. Karen was helping him adjust his pillows, and when she left us alone, he patted the folder gently. I need you to be my executor, he said. I blinked. You have a lawyer. I do. And he'll file the paperwork. But I need you to be the one who makes the calls, the decisions, handles the details. I don't want Ethan touching any of it. There was no bitterness in his tone, no anger, just clarity. I thought you'd leave everything to him, I said quietly. Walter gave a small, humorless smile. That's what he thinks too. He opened the folder and handed me the first page. It was the deed to the house transferred entirely into my name 2 months ago. No liens, no shared ownership, no surprises. I felt a wave of disbelief crash over me. But why? I asked. Because I've watched how you take care of people. Not just me. I've seen how you treat your patients, your coworkers, your family. And I've seen how he treats you. I tried to protest, but he held up a hand. I gave him every chance to grow into a man worth trusting. I hoped marriage might help, but now I see I was wrong. He went on to explain that his estate, what little was left after some significant business write-offs, would be put into a charitable trust. Ethan would receive a modest inheritance. Just enough to say he wasn't cut out entirely. The rest would go to organizations Walter had supported for decades. I'm not trying to punish him, Walter said, but I won't reward him for living like the world owes him everything. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and promised to carry out his wishes. 3 days later, Walter passed away in his sleep. I found him early in the morning, peaceful and still. Karen came shortly after, followed by hospice. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding his hand until they came to take him. Ethan didn't show up until noon. His face was unreadable when I told him. "Oh," he said. "So, what now?" That was it. No emotion, no moment of silence. Just, what now? "We plan the funeral," I said, trying not to show the tremor in my voice. "Let's keep it simple," he said. "Nothing fancy." I mean, he was a practical man, right? I stared at him, heart heavy. "You do what you want, Ethan. But I'm going to honor him properly," he scoffed. "Don't make this dramatic." He didn't know about the house. Not yet. Or the will. He thought he was about to inherit everything and start a new chapter, probably without me. I could see it in the way he carried himself, like he already had one foot out the door. A few days later, at the reading of the will, Ethan got the shock he deserved. The lawyer laid it out plainly. The house was already in my name. The remaining funds, about $120,000 after debt clearances, were going to a charitable trust. Ethan was left a check for $10,000 and a letter Walter had written months earlier. Ethan opened the envelope, read a few lines, and stood abruptly. His face was red, his jaw clenched. "This is a joke," he muttered. "This is some kind of joke." "It's not," I said calmly. He turned on me. "Did you put him up to this? You manipulated him." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The lawyer handed him a copy of the will and confirmed its legality. Ethan shoved the papers into his bag and stormed out. I sat there, feeling hollow but also steady, not joyful, not triumphant, just at peace. That night, I packed a small bag and stayed at a hotel. I didn't want to be under the same roof as a man who saw his father's death as a financial opportunity. I didn't want to listen to him rage or try to spin the story. I needed space to grieve Walter and to think. The next morning, Ethan called. "You can't just disappear like this," he said. "We need to talk." "I'm not disappearing," I replied. "I just need time, alone." "I can't believe this. I spent years taking care of him." "No," I interrupted. "You didn't. And he knew it." The line went silent. Then, finally, Ethan asked, "So what are you going to do now?" "I'm going to take care of what Walter asked me to do, and then I'm going to take care of myself." "You're seriously just walking away from all of this?" "I'm walking away from you," I said. And I hung up. After I hung up on Ethan, I stared at the phone in my hand for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't pace or second-guess myself. I just sat in the quiet of that small hotel room, letting the stillness soak in. The hum of the mini fridge, the faint traffic outside, the clean silence of being somewhere he couldn't reach me. It felt like breathing for the first time in months. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later. I went alone. Ethan showed up halfway through the service wearing a wrinkled suit and a sour expression. He didn't speak to me. He didn't sit near me. He stood in the back with his arms crossed, looking more like someone waiting in line at the DMV than a man saying goodbye to his father. Walter's longtime friend and business partner gave a short eulogy. He spoke about Walter's grit, his commitment to community, and how he'd built success not through greed, but through values. He was the kind of man who didn't just make money, he made purpose out of it. That line stuck with me. After the service, I went home, alone. I made a cup of tea, sat in the kitchen, and pulled out the envelope Walter had left me, his instructions, his blessings, his farewell. Inside was a handwritten letter. No dramatic secrets, no emotional bombs, just Walter's quiet, deliberate words. Cynthia, thank you for seeing me. Not as a burden, not as a name on a deed, but as a man still trying to finish life the right way. You didn't owe me anything, yet you gave anyway. That's what real family is. That's why I'm leaving you the house, not because it's valuable, but because it's home. Take care of it, or don't. Live in it, sell it, burn it down, and plant a garden. I trust you'll do what's right. I'm sorry Ethan wasn't what you needed. I hoped he'd grow, but you can't grow in soil that refuses to nourish anything. Be free now. Love again if you want. Or don't. Just make sure you live for you, W. I held the letter to my chest, and for the first time since he passed, I let the tears come. Not because I was broken, but because I finally felt seen, really seen. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with the lawyer, and tying up Walter's estate. Ethan called a few times. I didn't answer. Then he started texting at first, short and snippy. You really think this is fair? I did everything for that man. Then, quieter. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Jake flew in the following month to help me pack up some of Walter's personal things. He'd taken time off work and brought his girlfriend, Dana, with him. They stayed at a hotel in town, but spent every day with me sorting through boxes, documents, memories. This place feels good, Jake said one morning as we stood on the back porch with coffee. Not like a house. Like it still has a heartbeat. I smiled. It was Walter's soul. It never really felt like Ethan's. Jake nodded. What are you going to do now? That question had been buzzing in my head for weeks. What do you do when you're finally free? When the chaos is over but the dust hasn't quite settled? I think I'm going to sell the house, I said, surprising myself as the words came out. Jake raised an eyebrow. Really? Yeah. Walter gave it to me to do what I wanted with it. And I want something that's mine from the beginning. Not tied to him, not tied to Ethan, just mine. Jake grinned. You ever think about living by the water? I laughed. Every day since I turned 50. By the end of that week, we had sorted through everything. I kept a few of Walter's favorite books, a box of family photos, and his old fishing hat. The rest, we donated. I walked through each room one last time before handing the key to the realtor. I didn't look back when I drove away. Meanwhile, Ethan had spiraled. Word got around town that he'd started showing up at bars alone, talking big about the inheritance he never got. A friend of mine from the hospital said he tried to sell one of Walter's old watches online, only to find out it had already been appraised and listed as part of the estate trust. He'd lost the house, the money, and, slowly, his own dignity. The final straw came when I got a message from Dana. She said Ethan had contacted Jake on social media, asking for a loan. Jake had responded with 2 words, absolutely not. I was proud of him. 3 months after I sold the house, I bought a small cottage on the Oregon coast. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a sunroom, and a view of the ocean that made my heart swell every morning. I planted a little herb garden, adopted a lazy orange cat named Rusty, and signed up for a ceramics class at the community center. Sometimes I'd find myself setting 2 plates out for dinner, the muscle memory of old habits hard to break. But now, instead of sadness, I smiled and just put one back in the cupboard. I'd gotten an email from Ethan once more, a long-winded apology that smelled more like desperation than sincerity. He talked about how he messed up, how he was in therapy, and hoped I'd consider giving things another shot. I deleted it without replying. Walter had given me the tools I needed to leave, not just physically but emotionally. He'd seen what I refused to see, and he'd trusted me to take care of myself, even after he was gone. I still think of him sometimes, when I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the gulls circle above the shoreline. Not with grief, but with a gentle kind of gratitude. Some people enter your life and leave it better, even if their stay is short. Ethan had tried to own me, control me, use me. But Walter had simply seen me. And because of that, I finally saw myself. The first week in my new cottage felt like I'd moved into a postcard. Every morning started with the sound of waves brushing the shore just down the hill, and every night ended with a soft ocean breeze through the cracked window above my bed. The house wasn't perfect. There were creaky floorboards, and the plumbing had a mind of its own, but it was mine. No ghosts in the walls, no history that wasn't my own. I learned quickly that small towns on the coast came with their quirks. The grocery store closed at 6 p.m. sharp, rain or shine. Everyone knew everyone. People waved when they passed, even if you'd never met. And if you sat at the same coffee shop long enough, the waitress learned your name and your drink order without you saying a word. I'd been there just over 2 months when I spotted Ethan's name in an email subject line. It was from an old mutual friend who had once worked at the same hospital as me. I almost deleted it on instinct, but curiosity won out. Thought you should know, it read. Saw Ethan working part-time at a hardware store near Hillsborough. Heard he's sleeping on his cousin's couch. Don't know all the details, but he looks rough. I closed the email and sat back in my chair. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of how much space he had taken up in my life. Tired of how much damage he'd done by simply being careless and selfish. I told myself not to look him up. But of course, a week later, I did. His social media had gone quiet. No new photos, no grand updates. Just a blurry post about a fresh start and a quote about learning from failure. I almost laughed. The man hadn't learned a thing while we were together. What would change now? Still, a part of me wondered what he thought when the bank denied him access to Walter's account. Did he blame me? Did he ever truly feel ashamed of what he did? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. One afternoon, I walked down to the pier and bought a piece of grilled salmon from a food truck parked by the water. I sat at a bench, feet swinging just above the ground, watching boats bob lazily in the harbor. Mind if I sit here? A voice asked. I looked up and saw an older man, maybe late 60s, holding a sandwich and wearing a fishing hat that looked like it had seen 100 summers. Be my guest, I said with a polite smile. He sat down with a soft grunt and unwrapped his sandwich. For a while, we ate in silence. Then he said, "You're not from around here. That obvious, huh?" He chuckled. Not in a bad way. You've got that new beginning look about you. I smiled at that. Is it that obvious too? Oh yeah, he said. Happens a lot out here. Folks move to the coast trying to patch something up or leave something behind. This place has a way of smoothing out the rough edges. We didn't talk much after that, but his words stayed with me. Maybe I had been hoping the ocean would scrub me clean of the past. Maybe it was working. Back home, I opened the small chest I kept under my bed, the one with Walter's letter, some old photos, and the check for $10,000 that Ethan never even acknowledged after the will reading. He never cashed it, according to the attorney. I had deposited my portion of the estate and left it untouched in a separate account, just like I had with the small inheritance from Mike. These were the pieces of my past, not heavy with grief anymore, just reminders of where I came from and what I'd overcome. Jake called later that night. He sounded upbeat, and I could hear Dana laughing in the background. You sound happy, I said. We are, he replied. We've been talking about getting married. My heart skipped a beat. Really? Yeah. We're just waiting until we've saved enough for a small ceremony. Nothing fancy. Well, I said, if you want a beach wedding, I know a perfect little town with a stubborn plumbing system and a view that makes up for it. He laughed. I'll keep that in mind. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a while. So much had changed, but some good things remained constant. Jake had always been my anchor, my reminder that no matter how chaotic life got, there was something steady beneath it all. The next morning, I walked down to the garden to check on the herbs. My rosemary bush had gotten wild, and the basil was starting to flower. I trimmed them gently, humming to myself, and paused to watch a bumblebee bob from one bloom to the next. And then, in a moment that seemed both absurd and perfect, I saw someone walking toward my gate. It was Ethan. He looked thinner, older. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes sunken. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, and if I hadn't been standing in my own yard, I might not have recognized him right away. I didn't speak. I just waited. He stopped at the edge of the fence, hands in his pockets. "I wasn't sure you still lived here," he said. "I do," I replied. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" He looked down at his shoes. "I'm not here to ask for anything." I raised an eyebrow. "Really," he insisted. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I messed everything up." There was a long pause. "I know," I said. He looked surprised. "That's it? What else is there? You did what you did." I moved on. He stopped himself. "I thought maybe you'd still be angry." "I was," I said, "for a long time, but anger's heavy, and I'm too tired to carry it anymore." He nodded slowly. "I guess that's fair. I hope you're taking care of yourself," I added, and I meant it. Not out of fondness, but because I knew that even selfish people had to find their own way eventually. "I'm trying," he said. "Anyway, that's all I wanted to say." He turned and started to walk away. Before he reached the end of the block, I went back to the rosemary, snipped a few more sprigs, and carried them inside. I didn't tell him I forgave him. I wasn't sure I had. But I had something better, peace. And that was enough. The seasons changed quickly along the coast. One day I was watching the gulls float under a pale spring sun, and the next, a summer breeze was carrying salt through the open windows. I loved it. The house still creaked when the wind shifted, but I'd learned to sleep through it. The sound became familiar, like the sigh of an old friend. I'd found a rhythm. Mornings were for walking the beach trail with a thermos of coffee. Afternoons were for tending to the small garden I'd planted behind the house: herbs, tomatoes, a little lettuce patch that didn't do well in the sandy soil, but gave it an honest try. I was learning to be okay with things not turning out perfectly. That alone was progress. Sometimes I'd volunteer at the local community center, helping organize events for seniors or prepping meals. It gave me purpose, and I liked hearing stories from folks older than me. Their lives were full of chapters, some with heartache, others with redemption. Every time I listened, I felt less alone. Ethan never showed up again after that day at the gate. I wasn't surprised. He'd said his piece, and I'd said mine. That was that. I didn't need closure anymore. I already had it. But life, as always, had its own way of reminding you that peace doesn't mean stillness forever. I was folding laundry one Sunday afternoon when my phone rang. It was Dana. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, balancing a fitted sheet in one hand. "Hi, Cynthia. Listen, Jake doesn't know I'm calling you yet, but we have some news." I sat on the edge of the bed, heart skipping in the usual way moms feel when they sense a shift. "Is everything okay?" She laughed lightly. "More than okay. I'm pregnant." The silence stretched for a second before I broke into a wide grin. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful." She sounded relieved. "We just found out this morning. Jake's still trying to process it, but I knew you'd be thrilled." "I am," I said. "I really, really am." That night I lay in bed and stared up at the ceiling. I thought about Mike, about Walter, about how much they would have loved to be here for this. And then I thought about how much I wanted to be a part of this next chapter, not just as a visitor, but as someone they could lean on. I called Jake the next day. "You're going to be a grandpa," I teased. He groaned. "Don't start. I'm still wrapping my head around being someone's dad." "Well, when your mom shows up to knit baby booties, then we'll talk," I replied. We laughed. The kind of laugh that heals old wounds. The kind that says, "We made it." "Have you thought about where you're going to raise the baby?" I asked carefully. "We're not sure yet," he said. "We love Denver, but the idea of being closer to you, it's tempting." "I wouldn't mind moving closer, if that's what you want," I offered. There was a pause. "You do that, Jake?" I said softly. "I've had enough years making decisions around other people's needs. It's my turn now, and this is what I want." to be near my family, to be part of something again. The truth was, the cottage had been exactly what I needed, a quiet, healing place. But healing isn't meant to last forever. It's meant to get you ready for what's next. Within a month, I had a plan. I listed the house with a local agent and started looking for homes in Colorado, small, single-level places with room for a nursery when they needed it. Dana helped me search while Jake tried to keep his nerves in check. "I think we found a winner," she said one afternoon over video chat. She flipped the camera around to show a sweet little home just outside Boulder, with a tidy front porch and a yard big enough for a swing set. "I love it," I said, and I meant it. 2 weeks later, it was mine. Saying goodbye to the Oregon cottage was bittersweet. I walked the rooms one last time, touching the walls like they were pages in a book. I was closing for the final time. In the kitchen, I left a note taped to the inside of the cupboard. "May this home bring peace to the next soul who needs it." I cried a little on the drive east. Not from sadness, just the weight of leaving a place that held so much growth. That house had caught me when I fell. Now, it was time to stand tall and walk forward. When I arrived in Colorado, Jake met me in the driveway with a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Welcome home, Mom," he said. Dana was glowing. She looked like a woman who knew her whole life was about to change, and I saw something of myself in her, some version of who I'd been before life got complicated, before I learned that love could be both a salve and a weapon. They let me pick the nursery colors. We painted the room a soft sage green. Dana and I hung little animal prints while Jake struggled with a crib that came in far too many pieces. "This thing is a nightmare," he groaned, crawling on the floor with an Allen wrench. "You'll miss this when the baby's a teenager," I teased. A week later, I had dinner with an old friend who had also moved to Colorado years ago. Over burgers and iced tea, she said, "You look different, lighter." "I feel lighter," I said. That night, as I sat on my new porch under a string of warm yellow lights, I thought back to all the versions of myself I'd been. The young wife, the grieving widow, the cautious second bride, the nurse, the caretaker, the betrayed, the survivor. Now I was simply Cynthia, soon-to-be grandmother, a woman who had learned to stop clinging to people who didn't cherish her, a woman who'd found her voice. And I was ready for whatever came next. The days in Colorado passed easily, gently. Life wasn't exciting in the way it used to be, but it was warm and full in a different way, more settled. I spent mornings in my garden, afternoons helping Dana pick out baby gear, and evenings sipping peppermint tea while Jake fiddled with baby monitors or took calls from work. There was a comfort to it all, a rhythm I hadn't felt since my son was small and Mike was still alive. Dana's belly grew week by week, and I found myself talking to it when she wasn't looking. Soft things, like "You've got good people waiting for you," or "I'll be here when you need me." It felt silly sometimes, but it also felt sacred. That little heartbeat had already stitched itself into my world. One cool morning in late September, I was at the farmer's market in town picking up some late-season apples when I ran into someone I didn't expect to see. His name was Alan, a friend of Ethan's, the kind of friend who always smiled too wide and drank too much at parties. I hadn't seen him since the early months of my marriage, back when Ethan still pretended to be charming and present. "Cynthia," he said, brows raised. Wow, I almost didn't recognize you." I gave a polite smile. "Hi, Alan. You look great, healthy, happy." He said it with a kind of surprise, like maybe he expected I'd be haggard and broken. "I am," I replied simply. He nodded, clearly unsure what to say next. "You heard about Ethan, right?" My stomach turned just a little. "No, I haven't." He glanced around, leaned in like we were co-conspirators. "He's in bad shape, lost another job, still hopping couches. Tried getting into real estate, didn't work out. Word is he's borrowed from half the guys we used to know." I wasn't surprised, but it still hit me somewhere low in the chest. Alan kept talking, mostly to hear himself, I think. I told him, "Man, you had a good thing with Cynthia. Class act. But you know Ethan thinks he's the smartest guy in the room." I let him ramble. After a while, I excused myself and walked back to my car. the bag of apples feeling heavier than it should have. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, just staring at the dashboard. I didn't miss Ethan. Not the real him. But part of me still hated knowing how low he'd fallen, not because I felt guilty, but because I had once loved someone who turned out to be hollow. And that shadow doesn't disappear easily. That night, Dana noticed something was off. "You okay?" she asked as she folded a stack of tiny onesies. "Yeah," I said, then paused. "I ran into someone who knows Ethan." She didn't say anything at first, just looked up, waiting. "He's not doing well," I continued. "Sounds like he's still spiraling. Are you upset?" "No," I said. "Not exactly. I just feel sorry for the man I thought he was. But I also feel incredibly lucky I got out when I did." Dana came over and hugged me. "You've been through hell and back. You deserve all the peace you've got now." "I do," I whispered. And I believed it. A week later, Jake surprised me by taking a half-day off work. "Come with me," he said, jingling car keys. "Where are we going?" I asked. "You'll see." He drove us to a quiet stretch of road on the edge of town. At the end of it, nestled behind a small row of pine trees, was a cozy little storefront with a sign in the window that said "Available." "What is this?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "It's a used bookstore," Jake said. "Or it was. Now it's empty. But I thought, maybe you'd want to start something new." I blinked. "Me? Yeah. You've got the time, the energy. And I know how much you love stories." "I've never run a store in my life." Jake shrugged. "You've never been a grandma either. Doesn't mean you won't be amazing at it." I laughed then, really laughed, and something warm bloomed in my chest. The idea stuck with me. The next day, I called the realtor and asked to take a look inside. The building was small, just one open room, and a tiny back office, but it had big windows, hardwood floors, and shelves built into the walls that practically begged to be filled. I could already imagine the soft smell of old paper, the hum of a radio playing classics, the quiet joy of watching someone find the perfect book on a rainy day. A month later, Second Chapter Books opened its doors. The community welcomed it instantly. People brought in boxes of books to donate. Local authors asked to host readings, and parents came in with wide-eyed kids who picked out picture books and sat cross-legged in the corner. It wasn't a huge moneymaker, and it didn't need to be. It gave me purpose. It gave me connection. And, most importantly, it gave me joy. Then, just before Thanksgiving, a letter arrived. It was addressed to the store. No return address, just my name and a shaky scrawl. I opened it, and inside was a single handwritten note. "Cynthia, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know you were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too blind to see it. I hope you found the peace I never could. I hope the baby, if it's here, knows what kind of woman raised its father. I'm sorry, E." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer of my desk beneath a copy of Walter's letter. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. Just acceptance. People come and go. Some build you, some break you, and some, like Ethan, teach you how to build yourself. The day after Thanksgiving, Jake and Dana called. The baby was coming. I packed an overnight bag and drove straight to the hospital. And just like that, a new life began. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, but not out of fear, just anticipation. My first grandchild was on the way, and I couldn't quite believe that the next time I held a baby, it would be Jake's. It was hard to wrap my mind around the fact that the little boy I once cradled through fevers and scraped knees was now about to become a father himself. When I arrived at the maternity floor, Jake was pacing the hallway in that universal nervous dad shuffle. He looked up the moment he saw me. "Mom," he exhaled, like I was a lifeboat he hadn't realized he needed until he saw me. "How's Dana?" I asked, giving him a quick hug. "She's in with the nurse. Early labor, they say. Could be hours." "Good. Gives us time to calm you down." He laughed nervously and ran a hand through his hair. "I thought I'd be cooler than this. I really did. You're fine." Terrified, is just another word for being ready to love something more than you thought possible. Jake looked at me and nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, almost to himself. That's exactly what it feels like. We sat in the waiting area for a while, sipping vending machine coffee and talking in low tones. At some point, Jake admitted, I've been thinking about Dad a lot. Mike. It caught me off guard for a second. We didn't talk about him all that often anymore, but when we did, it was like opening a window that had been shut too long. What about him? I asked. Jake stared down at his hands. Just how he would have loved this, being a grandpa. He would have been terrible at diaper changes and spoiled that baby rotten. Jake smiled, a little teary-eyed. Yeah, probably would have bought the kid a mini motorcycle. He did always think safety was optional. We laughed. And for a moment, Mike was with us. Later that evening, a nurse appeared and waved us down. She's doing great. You can come meet your granddaughter. Granddaughter. My knees felt suddenly weak, not from age, but from the rush of emotion that overtook me. Jake and I followed the nurse into the room where Dana lay glowing with exhaustion and joy, holding the tiniest bundle I'd ever seen. Dana looked up and smiled. Say hello to Lila Marie. I stepped closer, and the moment I saw that baby's face, something cracked wide open inside me. Lila had Dana's delicate chin and a shock of dark hair. She blinked slowly, wrinkling her forehead, like she was already trying to figure out the world. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just pressed a kiss to Dana's forehead and whispered, She's perfect. Jake leaned down beside me and said, You want to hold her? I nodded, arms already reaching. And there she was, all 6 pounds and 10 ounces of new life. A fresh little soul, warm and soft in my arms. My arms that had held so many patience, grief, joy, regrets, but none quite like this. In that moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was no Ethan, no betrayal, no past, just Lila and me, and the quiet promise that I would love her with every fiber of who I had become. I hope you don't mind, Dana said softly. We gave her your middle name. I looked up, stunned. Marie? Jake nodded. It felt right. I held that baby tighter and knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The following weeks were a haze of feedings, diapers, coos, and lullabies. I stayed with Jake and Dana for a while, helping out in the way only a mother can, showing them how to swaddle, how to get a baby to sleep without losing your mind, how to make dinner with one hand while the other cradled a fussy newborn. We took Lila on slow walks around the neighborhood, bundled up in soft blankets. Strangers would stop and coo and tell me, Enjoy it, this part flies by. I already knew. Each time I held her, I thought of the women who'd shaped me. My own mother, long gone now. Dana, stepping bravely into her new role. And even women like Walter's late wife, strangers I'd never met, yet whose echoes still lived in the decisions made, the people left behind. And always, always, I thought of Walter. There was something about the way Lila's eyes scanned the room, like she saw more than we did. Walter used to say that babies had old souls, that they were born knowing everything and slowly forgot it as they grew. Watching Lila, I wondered if he'd been right. Sometimes at night, I'd sit beside her crib while she slept, just watching her chest rise and fall. I didn't need anything else in those moments. No noise, no distractions, just the miracle of her breath, the gentle warmth of knowing she was here and safe and loved. A few weeks later, back at my little bookstore, I hung a framed photo behind the register. Lila, in her father's arms, her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. Customers would ask, Is that your granddaughter? And I'd smile like the proudest woman on earth. Yes, I'd say. She's my second chapter. Business was steady. I kept a shelf labeled Staff Picks from Grandma Marie and filled it with stories I wanted Lila to grow up knowing. Brave little girls, curious minds, kind hearts. I imagined her sitting on the floor one day, legs crossed, reading one of those books while I swept nearby. It didn't matter how old I got, I'd always have something to look forward to now. Then, one crisp December afternoon, as snow started to drift lazily outside, Jake came into the shop holding Lila against his chest in one of those baby carriers. "She didn't want to nap," he said with a grin. "Thought we'd come bug, Grandma. You're always welcome here," I said, reaching out for my girl. I held her close, breathing in her soft baby scent, and felt something shift again, not a loss this time, but a gain, a fullness I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. I looked at Jake. "You're a good dad." His eyes glistened a little. "I learned from the best." I pressed my cheek to Lila's head and whispered, "Welcome to the world, sweet girl. We've been waiting for you." The first Christmas with Lila was quieter than the holidays I remembered from when Jake was young. There were no giant trees or a house full of noisy relatives, no mounds of wrapping paper scattered across the floor, or marathon cooking sessions that left me too tired to enjoy the celebration. But there was warmth. There was peace. There was something sacred about the way Dana rocked Lila by the fireplace, while Jake and I passed her cups of cocoa and whispered about which baby toy made her giggle the most. I hadn't decorated much, just a string of lights over the window and a small wreath on the door of my bookstore, but I didn't need anything flashy. After everything I'd been through, simplicity felt like the greatest gift of all. On Christmas morning, Jake handed me a small box wrapped in gold foil. Inside was a silver charm bracelet with a tiny engraved heart. On one side, Marie. On the other, Chapter 2. I couldn't speak for a moment, just looked at him and blinked back tears. "I figured it was time you got a little sparkle," he said, awkward in the way sons often are when giving sentimental gifts. "It's perfect," I said, pulling him in for a hug that neither of us wanted to end. The year rolled on. By spring, Lila was crawling. By summer, she was babbling like she had secrets to tell and was just waiting for the words to catch up with her thoughts. I spent more time at Jake and Dana's than I did at my own home. They never asked for help, but I could see the gratitude in their eyes every time I showed up with a pot of soup or folded the laundry without being asked. I never wanted to overstep, but Dana made it clear I was welcome. "You're not just our support system," she said one afternoon as we sat on the back deck. "You're part of our foundation." The bookstore thrived too. What started as a little passion project became a small town staple. We hosted author readings, community discussions, and story time for kids. Parents brought their toddlers, teens came in for study groups, and I had regulars, older folks who came not just for books but for connection. One of them, a retired English teacher named Harriet, stopped by every Tuesday. She'd buy a mystery novel, sip her tea slowly, and tell me about her years in the classroom. One day, as she picked up a novel by her favorite author, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, life isn't about rewriting the past. It's about writing forward. You did that. Most people just stay stuck in old chapters." I smiled, but inside, I knew how close I had come to staying stuck myself. How easy it would have been to let Ethan's betrayal turn me bitter, or to let grief chain me to the past. But I didn't. Walter helped me see the way out, and I'd walked through that door, even if I'd been trembling the whole time. Then, late one evening in July, something unexpected arrived. A letter. I knew the handwriting instantly. Ethan. I debated throwing it away, but something in me, curiosity perhaps, or just closure, made me open it. "Cynthia, I know I don't have a right to ask anything. I'm writing because I don't know who else to reach out to. I'm not asking for money. I swear. I'm not doing well. I've burned too many bridges. I know I said sorry once, but I want to say it again. For all of it. For what I did to you, to my dad. For what I didn't do. I heard you have a grandchild now. I hope you tell her the truth when she's old enough that her grandma walked through hell and came out the other side better, stronger. I wish I had been the man you thought I was. I'm trying now. It's slow. I'm not proud of where I am, but I'm not drinking. I'm working again. I just wanted to say I'm glad you found your peace. E. I sat with the letter in my lap. For a long time, there was no anger left in me. No hope either, just acceptance. Ethan was always chasing something: status, comfort, an identity that didn't require real effort. Maybe, for the first time, he was chasing accountability. I wished him well from afar, but I didn't feel the need to respond. That part of my life was finished. A few weeks later, I watched as Lila took her first steps wobbly, determined, arms reaching toward me. She tumbled right into my lap, giggling, and I scooped her up with tears stinging my eyes. "I've got you," I whispered. "You're safe." Jake snapped a photo at that exact moment, and later, he texted it to me with a single caption, "This is what healing looks like." I stared at that photo more than I probably should have. It reminded me that love, real love, didn't demand. It didn't drain. It gave. Sometimes I'd think about Walter, too. What he would have said if he'd lived to meet Lila. How he might have sat on the porch of the bookstore, sipping coffee and watching her scribble in the margins of coloring books. "Smart girl," he would have said. "Got that from her grandma." Maybe he was still watching, somewhere. In early fall, we hosted a story hour picnic at the park. I read books to a circle of wide-eyed kids, while their parents spread out on picnic blankets. Jake grilled hot dogs. Dana passed out cookies. Lila crawled into the lap of a little boy and tried to share her juice box. One of the parents came up afterward and said, "You're building something really special here." "I hope so," I replied. I looked around at all the children, the laughter, the simple joy of a Saturday afternoon spent in community, and realized I had built something. A life, a legacy, not out of wealth or status, but out of survival, love, and choice. Later that night, as I rocked Lila to sleep and stared at the soft flutter of her eyelashes, I felt a stillness I hadn't known in decades. Not emptiness, not grief. Stillness, a calm, quiet assurance that I had done what needed to be done, that I had protected what mattered, that I had chosen myself, and then, when the time was right, chosen others again, and for the first time, in a long time, I slept through the night without dreaming of the past. Autumn turned golden fast that year. The leaves in Boulder seemed to know they had just a few weeks to put on a final performance before the snow crept in. Every morning, the wind carried a crispness that signaled change, and I found myself reaching for a sweater before my first cup of tea had even cooled. It was in this time, this season of closure and quiet beauty, that I realized I was finally done looking backward. The bookstore became a local landmark in its own humble way. Parents brought their kids after school. Retirees spent afternoons reading by the window. Teenagers came in just to sit near the Wi-Fi and left with worn paperbacks tucked under their arms. It wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a gathering space, a tiny, beating heart in the middle of our neighborhood. I started hosting a once-a-month storytelling night. People from every age group would share something: a poem, a childhood memory, a short story they'd scribbled onto the backs of grocery receipts. There was something sacred about those evenings, where people dared to speak from the vulnerable corners of their lives and knew someone would be listening. One night, an older man named Glenn, who had served in the Navy, lost his wife to cancer, and raised 3 daughters on his own, stood up with a faded photo of his family in hand. His voice shook, but not from nerves. From reverence. "I just want to say," he said slowly, "that we all survive things we don't think we can. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we don't just survive, we rebuild." He looked straight at me when he said it. After everyone had gone home, I sat alone under the soft glow of the bookstore's lights and let myself cry, not from pain, but from understanding. We rebuild. And when we do, it doesn't mean the brokenness never happened. It means we're living proof that healing is possible. Jake and Dana's house had turned into a lively circus by then. Lila was walking more steadily, babbling nonstop, and starting to mimic everything. One afternoon, she pointed at the bookshelf in my living room and said, "Boops! Books!" I said, laughing. "Close enough." She clapped like she'd won the spelling bee. Dana was back at work part-time, and Jake had started taking Lila to a little daycare center a few hours a week. I still came by almost daily some days to babysit, others just to sneak in a hug. No one ever seemed tired of seeing me, which was a gift in itself. Then came the day that shifted everything again, though not with chaos, but with something quieter and even more powerful. I had closed up the bookstore early one Friday to go to the doctor for a routine checkup. Nothing urgent, just maintenance. My physician, Dr. Layton, was the kind of no-nonsense woman I trusted implicitly. She'd seen me through my recovery from surgery years earlier and remembered my birthday better than I did. As we wrapped up the exam, she sat across from me, tapping her pen lightly against her clipboard. "Everything looks good, Cynthia," she said, "but I want you to think about something." I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds ominous." She smiled. "Not at all. It's about longevity. You're healthy, strong. You've weathered your storms. But what are you doing to keep growing?" I tilted my head, puzzled. "You've been in survival mode for a long time. You've found peace, which is great. But I want you to ask yourself, are you still expanding your life? Are you still saying yes to new things?" Her words echoed in my ears for the rest of the day. That night, I went home, curled up with a blanket and a journal I hadn't touched in years. I wrote a single question at the top of the page. What now? I didn't answer it right away. Instead, I let it sit. The next few weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Posters at the community center for local travel groups, ads for adult education classes, a flyer for a writing retreat in Vermont. I began thinking less about what I had been through and more about what was possible. One morning, as I rocked Lila on the front porch and watched the sun stretch over the mountaintops, I whispered, "Would you be proud of a grandma who still wanted to chase her own dreams?" She drooled on my shoulder in response. I took that as a yes. That week, I enrolled in a creative writing class. The first night, I almost turned the car around twice, but I went. I sat in a circle of other souls who wanted to tell their truths. When it was my turn to share, I read a short piece titled Chapter 2, and when I finished, the room was so quiet you could have heard my heartbeat. Then came the applause. Real, honest applause. Later, the instructor approached me. "You've got something to say," she said, "and you say it well." I walked out of that room lighter than I'd gone in. One night, I sat on the couch with Jake while Lila napped and Dana caught up on sleep. "You seem different," Jake said. "I feel different." He looked at me, the same way he had when he was 5, and trying to figure out how the moon followed us in the car. "You happy, Mom?" "I really am." He nodded, and in that moment, I knew I had done it. I had lived through heartbreak and disappointment, through grief and betrayal, through long nights of wondering who I was without someone else to define me, and I had made it to the other side. I had rebuilt. And now, in this final chapter, or maybe it was just another beginning, I was living not out of obligation but out of choice. The bookstore, my family, my words. They were all part of a life I had created from the ashes. Ethan had been a storm. Walter had been a lighthouse. And I had become the steady shore. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart all at once. It unravels thread by thread, almost too quietly to notice. But when you finally step back and see the pieces scattered, you have a choice: to mourn what's lost or to rebuild with intention. Cynthia's journey reminds us that no matter our age or what we've endured, grief, betrayal, loneliness, there's still time to start again. Her story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming peace, one decision at a time. It's about realizing that we are never too old to choose ourselves, to let go of what harms us, and to say yes to what heals. She didn't just survive, she grew. She rediscovered her voice, her passions, and the beauty of being present in a life she created on her own terms. For many of us over 65, it's easy to believe the big changes are behind us. But Cynthia's story tells a different truth. New beginnings don't come with a deadline. Whether it's becoming a grandparent, starting a business, or simply saying no more to what no longer serves us, we still have chapters left to write. And maybe, just maybe, the best part of the story is still ahead.